lighting sucks. Doesn't matter. I'm tired. It's late. Doesn't matter. I just want to talk about the Batman for a bit. No spoilers in this webcam rambling. I'm just talking to my camera right now because I have some thoughts that I'd like to share about Matt Reeves' The Batman. It's really wonderful what he accomplished, right? Matt Reeves managed to make totally his own Batman movie. Like, everything about it screams Matt Reeves. And it's incredible. It's fantastic. On Letterboxd, I give it 5 stars pretty much immediately. But what's interesting is that naturally, it's a Batman movie, so you got to compare it to the godfather of all Batman movies. You have to compare it to Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight. And when you do that, I feel like you're creating a bit of a false dichotomy, which is kind of a wonderful thing, because they're both Batman films, but that's pretty much it. That's the only similarities. Because what DC Comics inherently is about, unlike Marvel, is they're not really about characters, they're more about ideas. So Matt Reeves and Christopher Nolan both took the idea of Batman, and then they made their own stories about that idea. But they're both just so good, and they're very different ways. They're incredibly different. They're just about as different. They're maybe even more different than Zack Snyder and Richard Donner's takes on Superman. They're both incredibly valid and equally well done takes on the character of the Dark Knight, but they're both equally Batman. Inherently, and this is something that I love about DC characters, is because unlike Marvel, they're hollow archetypes. There's nothing there. There is the basic premise, the idea of who the character is, but then beyond that, you have nothing, which as a writer, that gives me so much room to play with. So, like, the Batman is obviously Matt Reeves' take on the character, just as much as the Dark Knight trilogy was Snyder's, or Batman v Superman was Zack Snyder's. They're all equally Batman, but they're so different, but they're still Batman. And I feel like I should elaborate on the hollow archetypes points, especially when comparing it to Marvel, because DC's an incoherent fantasy compared to Marvel being a 60s sci-fi. So when I ask you, who's Iron Man, or who's Mr. Fantastic, I'm pretty much going to get the same answers from everyone. There's like one defining character, that is Tony Stark or Reed Richards, and that's because they've been the same person since the 1960s. But when I ask you, who's Aquaman? Or who's Martian Manhunter? Besides maybe their backstory or their power set, I'm going to get wildly different answers of who they are as a person, who they are as a character. Because the DC universe is constantly getting rebooted and the universe is being reset. So that it's hard to get what the idea of Aquaman is when you're going from different comic runs to comic runs, because each writer is just playing with that character and creating and molding who they think that character should be. And this is no exception with DC. Like, Batman is a pinnacle of what I'm talking about here. Look at the 1960s. You have the 1966 Batman show with Adam West, which is basically a parody on making fun of the idea of Batman. And it's wonderful. It's great. Adam West just hams it up. But then you get into the 1980s, and Frank Miller comes with The Dark Knight Returns, and suddenly Batman's dark and gritty. And then you have the Tim Burton films, which reflect that. And then you have stuff like Batman Incorporated with Grant Morrison, which is a bit more lighthearted. You have the Bat family in that aspect. But the idea of Batman is still there. There's that fundamental foundation. But whatever they're doing with the character is so incredibly different. Because, just take the murder of the Waynes. Sometimes the murder of the Waynes is a senseless act of violence by some druggie who wants some drug money. Or sometimes the Waynes were murdered out of a hit. They were killed by a crime family. Sometimes Batman is old, sometimes he's just starting out, sometimes he's smiling, sometimes he's angry. But no matter what version you're looking at, there is the fundamental through line that Batman is a billionaire who was hurt a long time ago, using that as an excuse to hurt someone now. And that's the fundamental idea of Batman, and that can be traced through every single version of the story. So back to The Dark Knight and the Batman. Sorry, I'm just kind of rambling. The Dark Knight is the best Batman movie Christopher Nolan could make. It's a masterpiece. And I think it's just ineffective to compare it to another piece of art that is so vastly different. The only way that I would directly compare Matt Reeves is the Batman to The Dark Knight is if Matt Reeves was given the exact same script, cast, budget, everything. If everything the exact same, they just told the two directors, go and see what you came up with. That's when I would correct it. But Matt Reeves is doing something completely different to Nolan. Because, I mean, they're both Batman stories. That's pretty much the only line of comparison I could find between The Dark Knight and the Batman. They're both great. I love them both. I personally think The Dark Knight's a tad overrated. It's not the greatest movie ever. It's good. It's great. It's just not a masterpiece. Well, it is a masterpiece, but it's not like the masterpiece that people claim it to be. Yeah, so that's pretty much all I have to say on the Batman. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, comment section exists. Crazy, right? All right, I'm done. Yeah, I'm going to bed. I'm tired.